So recently, for my 50th episode of the AFAL podcast, I talked about my favorite topic, the Black Death. And in that episode, we learned all about that most famous of plague pandemics, which wiped out roughly one third of the affected populations of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But as we know, the Black Death was not the only instance of plague. It came back in waves time and time again, and there was a particularly bad one that affected London in 1665 and 1666. And a major reason why the plague stopped there and didn't get any worse was because of the Great Fire of London. So, in today's episode, I want to talk all about the plague and the fire. What happened? How did things get so bad? How many people died of both the plague and the fire? How are the two connected, and what happened to London as a result? As always, we'll start with the historical context to get a good sense of 17th century London. That's the 1600s. And from there, we'll talk about the plague pandemic that ravaged the city, how the fire actually saved London from further death, and what changed as a result. So let's get started. There was there was a lot going on in 17th century England. This was the Stewart period, and a lot happened, like the English Civil Wars. And you know what? Let me give you the briefest of tangential summaries just to give you a sense of the times. Sorry in advance to my editor. Oh well, let's get started. The English Civil Wars were conflicts between Parliament and King Charles I over the balance of power between the monarchy and the nobility. Essentially, Charles believed he and his family had divine rights to rule over England, and that absolute monarchy was the only way to effectively run a government. The nobility, and more broadly the parliament, disagreed. And we can trace this balance of power conflict all the way back. Think of the Magna Carta, signed in 1215, when King John was essentially strong armed into limiting the power of the monarchy and also conceding that the king was not above the law. Charles I's belief in divine right and absolute power over his people challenged the precedents set by the Magna Carta, and the people were not having it. And as a result, three civil wars broke out between Charles and his parliament. Now, in addition to the political tensions in this period, we also have religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants. This all started with Henry VIII. You know, the one with six wives who rejected Catholicism and established the Anglican Church in the previous century, the 1500s, more specifically 1534. But in the Stewart period, we have both Catholic and Protestant monarchs. My bigger point here is that there was a lot of religious and political tension. So much so, in fact, that King Charles I was tried and executed for committing treason. And the text of this is, quote, by the fundamental laws of the kingdom, it is treason for the King of England, for the time being, to levy war against the Parliament and Kingdom of England. End quote. They beheaded him on January 30th, 1649, for being a, quote, tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. And for those of you wondering, it was a beheading by sword. And it was one clean strike, which is good, because sometimes the executioner can miss, or he doesn't chop all the way through, and it just gets extra bloody and horrific and kind of nasty. So that is the century of England that we're talking about here. And shortly after Charles's execution, his son and heir, Charles, what would have been Charles II, was chased away to mainland Europe, and Oliver Cromwell ruled as the Lord Protector for a while. It was an 11-year period where England didn't have a monarchy, but a republic, and we generally call this era in English history the Protectorate. That all ended in 1660. Cromwell died in 1658, and his son just wasn't very effective. How many times does that happen, right? Like, we have one strong monarch and then the heir is awful and the whole thing just collapses. I feel like that happens a lot. But anyway, um, Cromwell's son, not super effective. So the protectorate experiment clearly wasn't working, and Charles II was brought back over from the continent to rule England. Now, if you listen to my previous episode on the Black Death, you might remember that many people in 14th century Europe believed that plague was a punishment from God, that they had done something wrong, and this is what they got as a result. Or maybe they weren't pious enough or something, right? And what's really interesting to me here is that that fear was alive and present during this political and religious chaos too. What would God make of all of this religious conflict? The Catholics were worried about the strength of Protestantism in England and what would happen as a result. The Protestants thought the same thing of the Catholic minority. How would God react to beheading a king, right? Especially one that preached divine right, the idea that God chose him to rule. Loyalists, who were those in favor of a strong monarchy, were scared of the ramifications of Charles's execution and the establishment of a republic. The parliamentarians feared that bringing Charles II back would unleash a plague on England because it went against what they thought God's wishes were. It was a tense time, and given England's history with plague, the people were afraid they would be punished for all of these indiscretions. And then 5 years after Charles II came back into power, in 1665, the plague arrived. Now, we have some excellent primary sources about the Great Plague of London. Chroniclers like Samuel Pepys lived through Charles I's execution, Cromwell's protectorate, the restoration of Charles II, the Great Plague, the Great Fire, and also an attack by the Dutch in 1666 as part of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. That's a whole thing too, and not the focus of today's episode, but like I said, there is a lot going on in 17th century England. Now, much of the primary source information we have comes from men like Samuel Pepys. There were later works too, like Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, but that was written decades later in 1722. And if the name Daniel Defoe sounds familiar to you, he also wrote Robinson Crusoe. Now, after the Black Death, there were several other bigger plague epidemics in England. In 1563, around 18,000 people died in London alone. It was so intense that Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, left London with her court to quarantine at Windsor and threatened execution if anyone from London followed them there. She was super afraid of getting the plague, and rightly so, frankly. Like I mentioned in the Black Death episode, that Princess Joan died of plague during the 14th century during the Black Death. So, legitimate fear. Legitimate fear. In 1592, another plague epidemic came rolling around, but this time the winter was relatively mild, so the plague lasted through to the next year, and again, about 18,000 Londoners died. The next big plague epidemic in London was in 1625, and following cues from previous ones, everyone who could flee the city fled. It was the only way to make sure they didn't get sick, and around 40,000 Londoners died during this one. And there were some minor outbreaks in the in between years, but they were nothing compared to the Great Plague of 1665 to 1666. The first hints that this would be a big plague epidemic came that June, when a big fair was cancelled. And according to Samuel Pepys's diary, the plague was ravaging Amsterdam across the English Channel in 1663, so most feared that it would hop on over to England. I mean, Amsterdam is only 180 miles, give or take, from the entrance to the Thames, and it's even closer to East Anglia if you're just trying to pick like the shortest distance between the two. So it didn't take long for the plague to hop on over, just like everybody feared, and make its way into London. Now, I've already gone over the plague, how it spreads, its symptoms, and whatnot in my previous video on the Black Death. So for more specifics on yersinia pestis, go listen to that episode. The plague spread mostly in the same way. Infected fleas who bring infected plague blood from a rodent to humans through their bites. What I'm more concerned with, though, in today's episode is how the plague connects to the London fire in 1666. And the best way to explore that connection is to look at how the city tried to combat the plague. From previous examples, we know that those who could afford to leave the city left, and that was no exception here. But most people in London didn't have a summer palace or the opportunity to leave, so they were stuck. Now, the plague likely started in St. Giles in the Field, which is a poor and densely populated area north of Westminster, at least it was at the time, which is only a few blocks away from the British Museum is today. Today, it's not poor and cramped and gross. Today, it's lovely. But back in the day, it was not the best area, and so you often found diseases kind of pooling in that area. So what did they have to deal with at St. Giles in the Field, and how did the city try to prevent the spread of plague to the rest of it? Well, we get some good insight from Samuel Pepys, who was there. Quote, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me. End quote. Red crosses were painted on the doors of houses that had plague inside. When plague appeared in a house, the household was sealed with the whole family in there, essentially condemning the whole family to die, unless someone happened to have a really good immune system and fought off the infection or just never got it. Rare, but it happened. And the quarantine would last 40 days. So if you walked around London and you saw a red cross painted on a door, you knew to avoid that house like the plague. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Now, according to Daniel Defoe, who again wrote his story decades later, so we do have to take it with a grain of salt, there were men who went around at night with carts collecting the dead bodies. And if you've seen Monty Python on the Holy Grail, that scene with the bring out your dead criers was inspired by this. Daniel Defoe, in his book, writes, quote, "It is to be noted here that the dead carts in the city were not confined to particular parishes, but one cart went through several parishes, according as the number of dead presented. Nor were they tied to carry the dead to their respective parishes, but many of the dead taken up in the city were carried to the burying ground in the outparts for want of room." End quote. In short, the dead were taken to wherever to be buried, wherever there was room. And we know through lots of archaeological evidence and church records that many were thrown into communal plague pits, mass graves where the dead would be buried en masse because there was just no room and no time for individual burials. It reminds me of my episode on the catacombs of Paris a little bit. They had the same problem with all the dead bodies from the French Revolution and Reign of Terror and no space to put them. I mean, the graves were so full of churches and in graveyards that like they couldn't even like limbs were poking out of the ground. It was pretty nasty, right? Now in London, there were a bunch of big plague pits. One of them was called the Great Pit at Aldgate, which is just north of the Tower of London, and another northwest of that in Finsbury Fields. Archaeologists discovered a mass grave in 2015 at the Bedlam Burial Ground in East London associated with the 1665 plague, and they were able to confirm that it was, in fact, plague that was killing the people. This particular pit had about 3,500 bodies in it. I mean, we're talking a big mass grave here. It was a rough job carting the dead bodies out of the city. You'd be walking around all night, loading up a cart with heavy weight of multiple corpses, and then wheeling it out of the city and dumping it into the pits before going back for even more. They wouldn't go into any of the Red Cross houses if they still had anyone left inside, though. They would just ring a bell to let families know that the cart was outside, and if you had a body, you would bring it out and slump it on the cart. Now, to help ward off the plague, the cartmen would soak a cloth in vinegar and wear it across their face like a mask to ward off miasma. You know, I talk about it all the time. That bad, stinky air that most people believed was the cause of disease. But of course, that didn't actually help, and those wheeling the plague carts around would usually die off, of plague, and the city would just employ the next guy looking for work and willing to risk his life for it. And soon enough, they'd start collecting the bodies by day anyway because there were just too many to only do it at night. And this is according to Samuel Pepys anyway, so this part we know to be true. To make sure that people didn't escape from quarantine house, there were watchmen posted on the street corners. But the watchmen would also inform the cart pushers if nobody else in the house responded, meaning everybody died inside, and only then would the cart pushers go into the house, retrieve the dead bodies, and move on with their day. But despite London trying to quarantine the sick and keep them from moving around, plague still spread throughout London and beyond. For example, a bundle of cloth was sent from London to Eyam in Derbyshire, which is in the Peak District in the triangle of lands between Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield. Now, this cloth bundle was infested with plaguey fleas, and up to 80% of the village died. It could have been worse, but I mean, it couldn't have been worse for the city, for Eyam, right? But the local clergyman within Eyam, called William Mompesson, persuaded the villagers not to flee, but to stay and get sick, knowing a lot of them would die, but preventing it from spreading beyond the village. And it worked. 260 people died in Eyam, earning it the nickname Village of the Damned and sometimes Plague Village. But the town-wide quarantine stopped the plague from spreading any further, saving a lot of lives in the long run. So, this tells us then that despite the quarantining measures, despite their attempts to remove the dead, ward off miasma, and police the sick so they didn't leave and spread the disease, it got out anyway. And because we know now that it was the fleas spreading plague, and fleas lived on rats, it was the areas where rats congregated that were most affected by plague. The dirty, cramped, overly populated areas of London, which happened to be where the poor lived and where the poor were relegated. So, of course, many of the upper classes who were able to isolate or leave the city and therefore didn't get the plague associated plague with the poor, not the real cause, poor sanitation. Now, in September 1665, it was reported that 7,165 Londoners died in 1 week. The total London death toll for this plague epidemic is recorded as 68,596. And though I've seen historians estimate that it was probably closer to 100,000, but about 15% of the population died of London, which is massive. Plague cases lessened over the winter of 65 to 66 because the cold killed off a lot of the fleas that spread bubonic plague, but it was still lingering around in the early years of 1666. The epidemic in London only really ended with the Great Fire of London. In the early morning hours on September 6th, 1666, the fire started in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. Yes, a bakery on Pudding Lane. I love it when stuff like this happens. So we're not 100% sure what caused the fire, but most believe that it was a spark from the oven that jumped out and ignited a nearby pile of kindling and or wood. Regardless of how it happened, the whole bakery slash house was soon on fire. And just to circle back to my context for a quick second, Thomas Farriner was King Charles II's personal baker. The Stewart king exiled to the mainland for a while until loyalists brought him back right after Oliver Cromwell's protectorate failed, and Charles II factors into the Great Fire story as well, so I'll come back to him in a little bit, but I just like when there's all these connections. Now, fires were common enough that they wouldn't always warrant a massive response. So, when the Lord Mayor of London was notified of a fire in his city, he dismissed it and apparently said, quote, "Pish, a woman might pee it out." Rude and untrue, because the fire started rapidly spreading. The summer had been hot and dry, so fire danger was pretty high, and many of the buildings were either made of wood or made of brick with wooden roofs, so there was plenty to burn. Some of the houses were also built in the wattle and daub style, which is a mixture of reeds and animal dung and straw and water, flammable, built with flammable stuff, right? 300 houses quickly caught fire and collapsed, and a wind pushed the fire east, demolishing more structures in its path. Today, our immediate thoughts go to a fire department, right? Couldn't the firemen just go out there and help? I've got a good friend who's a fireman. Hi, Brian. So that's where my brain goes. Just send Brian out there to go take care of the problem, right? But in 17th century London, there wasn't a fire department or specific firefighters who would be sent in to save the day. Instead, it was citizens. Those watchmen might help soldiers, whoever was around, frankly, with buckets of water or hand operated water pumps. Think like a giant super soaker water gun that took 3 people to operate, right? They had these really big hand powered things that would help a little bit, but nothing like what we have today. But the primary way to prevent the spread of fire in 17th century London was to employ fire breaks. Basically, tear down walls, buildings, whatever you could around the fire so it had nowhere to travel. Then you can focus on putting out that now contained fire with buckets of water. We still do fire breaks today with forest fires. You're essentially drawing a line around the fire to contain it to one area and then just focusing on putting it out. But in the act of doing this, people's homes and businesses would be destroyed, right? So it wasn't a great solution for the middle of a crowded city that was still dealing with plague, mind you, and you couldn't just decide to do it anyway. You needed the Lord Mayor's permission. But the Lord Mayor wasn't having it, right? Because, and I'll paraphrase his words again, he thought the fire was so weak that a woman might be able to pee it out. So he didn't use fire breaks right away, which he should have done. It was actually King Charles II who ordered the fire break, and it was our friend
Hmm.
and chronicler Samuel Pepys who informed
Hmm.
him of the fire. But by the time Londoners started to employ the fire breaks, it was too late, and the fire was just too big. The fire spread to London Bridge, and it destroyed a massive water wheel there, cutting off a big source of water that people needed to fight the fires. And no, this is not the London Bridge falling down from the nursery rhyme. That was during 1135 during a different fire, which destroyed the bridge, and they later rebuilt it out of stone so it would survive ensuing fires. And it did, it survived the fire of 1666. And more than just survive the fire, it actually acted as a fire break. There were some stores and homes kind of lining the bridge at the time, but there was enough of a gap in between them so that the fire was not able to travel south across the Thames. So, thanks, London Bridge. Appreciate it. Now, not only did King Charles II authorize the fire breaks and do his best to control the fires with the law as much as he could, but he was also there physically helping. He had originally left London for Hampton Court and later Oxford to isolate from the plague, but he had returned in February 1666 when plague numbers were slightly better than they were. Don't forget the winter helped kind of quell the plague a little bit. So after ordering for fire breaks, he decided to sail down the Thames to check out the progress. And when he saw that the fires were still raging, he called for even more drastic fire breaks, pulling down even more homes and buildings. I've even read some sources that suggest that he was manning some water buckets himself, boosting the morale of his people and encouraging them to keep working hard. So that's pretty neat. Several important buildings were destroyed by the fire, including St. Paul's Cathedral. The original cathedral was first built in 1087 and finished in 1314. It had survived several fires before this and was in the process of restoration at the time of the Great Fire. Because of the English Civil Wars, progress on the restoration had paused. But earlier that year, 1666, restoration had begun again, only for the whole thing to be swallowed up by the fire and destroyed that summer. Bummer. It was demolished and rebuilt, and that rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral is the one that you can visit today. Now, luckily, the fire really only burned for about 4 days. The winds subsided, the fire breaks were finally working, and there was no fuel left for the fire to grow. Londoners were able to use their water buckets and hand pumps to put out the now contained fire, and the whole crisis ended on September 5th, 1666. And though hundreds of thousands of people were now made homeless, it is reported that miraculously only 6 people died in the fire. I bet more died that weren't reported or found, but still, the official death toll is only 6. But the city itself was destroyed. Only 1/5 of London was left standing, which is massive. I mean, we also need to consider that London was much, much smaller back then than it is now, but still, 4/5 of the city was destroyed in the fire? That's crazy. The loss of property was estimated at 5 to 7 million pounds, which is a huge amount for the 17th century, right? And a quick calculation in a British pound inflation calculator tells me that that is upwards of 1.3 billion pounds today. But the fire also had the added benefit of burning much of the filth, the hay, and other places where plague rats and their fleas lived, helping to end the plague epidemic that was definitely winding down by this point, but wasn't completely gone. So, that's a bonus. After the fire ended, things clearly had to change for London. The political and religious tensions in the Stewart period were bad enough, and alongside these horrible years of 1665 to 1666, also consider in the background of this whole century, you've got groups of settlers leaving England for settlements in the New World, right? I mean, Jamestown was alive and kicking by this point, and the Puritan colonies in New England are also going strong. So that's all happening in the background. And then there were the English Civil Wars, the Protectorate. Like I've said a few times now, there was a lot going on in 17th century England. But on top of all of this, the future threats of plague and now fire needed to be dealt with decisively. So, the king ordered several changes in London's city planning to prevent future fires, and these changes also happened to prevent infestations of rats and therefore outbreaks of plague. He called for buildings to be built with brick instead of wood, as it was clear that brick could survive a fire a lot better than something flammable. So the king essentially decreed that if you built your house with brick or stone, you're good, but if you don't, it will be torn down until it's built with the proper materials. Then, he called for the streets to be wide enough to serve as fire breaks, so that the fire can't jump from one house to another just right over the road. Houses, this is a great thing, right? Because prior to this, London streets were really cramped and houses would lean together over each other, creating these tiny, narrow alleyways that would serve as streets, giving a very claustrophobic effect while walking down them. And on that note, the king also decreed that no lanes or alleys should be built unless they were really needed. He did not want any houses near the river, presumably for better access to the water for putting out fires, and he didn't want anything too close together either. He also decided that certain trades should be placed together, like brewers or dyers or bakers, so if they had to have a fire running, all of the fireplaces were kind of together. So, pretty good ideas for new city planning. Really sensible, in fact. And not only would they help in future fire outbreaks, but without really knowing, they also helped with the general sanitation levels in London. There would be fewer cramped places for rats and fleas to hide out. The new London was cleansed from its old, cramped past, and though it still had some room for improvement, particularly with river sanitation, see my episode on the London cholera epidemic for that one, it was certainly a new London, and better than before. Today, you can find a monument near Pudding Lane where the fire began, a stark reminder of those terrible years, 1665 to 1666, when London had to deal with plague and its worst fire. But at least it helped London grow from the vestiges of its cramped, dirty medieval past to a new, early modern future. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Great Fire and Great Plague of London. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to FL on YouTube, and go listen to Nedrick Music, who's the musician behind my intro and outro song. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.